What if I told you a farm was officially launched before the land was even owned, and nearly 2 years later there are still no visible flower fields, just big promises, big acreage, and even bigger questions? Today we are opening the vault on Tada Farms, breaking down the timeline, the permits, the merch, and the growing doubts. You are not going to want to miss a single second of this deep dive, so stick with me till the end. And if you love real talk with receipts, hit that subscribe button right now and join the fastest growing community that keeps it honest every single week. When the headlines first surfaced about Tada Farms, it sounded like the beginning of a reinvention story, a woman stepping out of a long public marriage and into independence, carving something tangible from the soil of North Carolina alongside her daughter Maddie and son-in-law Caleb. And for a moment, it felt inspiring because viewers of Sister Wives have watched Janelle Brown for years navigate family fractures, financial stress, and emotional transitions. So the promise of land ownership, 156.4 acres purchased for $289,000, carried symbolic weight. It was not just dirt, it was a declaration of autonomy. But as we open the vault and trace the timeline carefully, a detail emerges that refuses to sit quietly in the background. The business license for Tada Farms was filed on March 26, 2024, while the land itself was not officially purchased until April 1, 2024. And that sequence alone has become the spark that ignited months of online conversation because it presents a question that viewers cannot ignore. Was this strategic planning, or was it premature positioning? And while filing a license before closing on property is not unheard of in business circles, it becomes dramatic when paired with the public narrative of building from the ground up, because the ground technically was not yet theirs when the paperwork was submitted. And that tension between narrative and record creates suspense that lingers over every subsequent update. Then comes the emotional layer that adds even more gravity to the story. The filing occurred during a month of immense personal tragedy for the family, a time when grief would understandably consume any parent. And many fans have expressed both compassion and confusion, wondering how anyone balances loss with launching a new venture. And that contrast does not prove anything improper, yet it amplifies curiosity because it reveals resilience, or perhaps compartmentalization, at a level that feels almost cinematic. And as the Instagram announcement rolled out, promising sweat, dirt, and learning along the way, the audience leaned forward, expecting visible transformation. Tractors arriving, soil turning, greenhouse frames rising, irrigation lines stretching across the acreage. But nearly 2 years later, the only confirmed physical progress appears to be residential construction, homes rising where fields were meant to bloom. And that visual gap has fueled the core question: is Tada Farms a delayed agricultural project or a lifestyle rebrand, anchored more in merchandise than marigolds? Because alongside the aspirational captions came branded shirts, aprons, and a polished website describing Janelle as the farm's resident dreamer, planner, and future flower whisperer. And in the age of influencer entrepreneurship, launching merchandise early is not unusual. Yet, when tangible farming infrastructure remains unseen, the optics invite skepticism, especially from viewers who understand agriculture as labor-intensive, capital-heavy, and unforgiving to inexperience. Farmers across the country have weighed in, explaining that cultivating peonies or specialty blooms can require years before profitability, that soil testing, zoning compliance, pest management, seasonal fluctuations all make the journey from field to Voss a formidable endeavor, not a task undertaken lightly. And as we gather here today, with curiosity and a sharp eye for detail, we are witnessing a live public narrative unfold. The future of Tada Farms hangs in the balance, awaiting visible action. So, before you weigh in with your own thoughts in the comments, hit that subscribe button and join the fastest growing community that keeps it honest every single week. Together, we will unpack these developments and see what surfaces next, from the ground up or merchandise out. Unpredictability and distribution logistics form a complex web that cannot be rushed. And if reports suggesting wetlands on portions of the property are accurate, then environmental surveys and Army Corps of Engineers approvals could significantly slow development. And wetlands regulations exist for ecological protection, meaning any build-out must navigate layers of federal and state oversight. And that reality introduces another possible explanation for the visible pause. Progress may be happening on paper rather than in petals. Yet, without transparent updates, speculation thrives because silence in the digital era becomes its own narrative, and viewers begin connecting dots, comparing this venture to previous family projects, some successful, some short-lived, and wondering whether momentum will sustain this time or whether enthusiasm will quietly taper off. And the suspense loop tightens further when fans recall Maddie's prior podcast venture that launched with excitement only to conclude quickly, leading critics to question long-term commitment, while supporters argue that public experimentation is part of growth and should not be weaponized against future efforts. And somewhere between those perspectives stands Tada Farms, suspended in possibility, neither confirmed triumph nor exposed illusion, just a concept awaiting visible proof. And as the months stretch toward the 2-year mark since that first celebratory post, the contrast between merchandise availability and agricultural absence becomes the centerpiece of debate. Because shirts and aprons are tangible, immediate, and purchasable, while flower fields require seasons, permits, labor, and capital. And that asymmetry shapes perception, even if it does not define intent. And so, viewers continue asking, will this acreage eventually transform into rows of blooms open for community picking days, weddings, and farm stands? Or will it evolve into a smaller scale garden anchored by residential life rather than commercial agriculture? And until soil is visibly cultivated, infrastructure erected, and harvests documented, the story remains open-ended, inviting analysis from every angle: financial, logistical, emotional, and symbolic. Because beyond the practicalities lies a deeper theme: reinvention after public separation, the pursuit of independence through land ownership, the desire to build something rooted, literally and figuratively. And that emotional undertone is what prevents the conversation from collapsing into simple cynicism. It is not merely about zoning classifications or business filings. It is about whether a dream, publicly declared, can withstand the scrutiny of time and the weight of expectation. And as we stand at this midpoint in the narrative, the land is real, the license is real, the merchandise is real, the houses are rising, yet the farm itself remains unseen. And that absence, more than any allegation, keeps audiences watching, waiting, and refreshing for the next update that might finally reveal whether Tada Farms is quietly germinating beneath regulatory delays, or whether it was always more vision than vineyard, more branding than botany. And until that reveal arrives, the vault remains open and the suspense continues to grow, alongside the question that refuses to fade. What will truly bloom on those 156 acres, and when? As the conversation deepens, the focus shifts from what has been promised to what is realistically required. Because building a flower farm on 156 acres is not simply a matter of planting seeds and waiting for sunshine. It is a layered operation involving soil analysis, irrigation planning, equipment acquisition, labor scheduling, crop selection, marketing, distribution, compliance, insurance, and long-term capital management. And when viewers with agricultural backgrounds begin outlining these realities, the suspense grows heavier. Not because anyone wishes failure, but because the scale of the undertaking demands clarity and endurance. farmers have shared that even small-scale operations require greenhouses to extend seasons, climate monitoring systems to protect fragile blooms, refrigeration units for storage, reliable vehicles for transport, relationships with florists, event planners, and wholesalers, and constant social media engagement to drive direct-to-consumer sales. And that list expands when considering zoning classifications, especially if portions of the acreage are designated wetlands, which can limit structural development and require federal review before alteration. And if environmental surveys are indeed part of the process, then timelines can stretch quietly behind the scenes, with paperwork moving slower than public expectation. And yet, in the absence of visible tractors or planted rows, audiences fill the silence with theories. Some believe the merchandise was launched as an early revenue stream to support property improvements, while others argue that influencer-based business models often begin with brand identity before physical infrastructure. And both perspectives carry logic, because in modern entrepreneurship, narrative can precede production. However, the tension arises when nearly 2 years pass without documented agricultural milestones, and that duration fuels comparison to past ventures within the extended family sphere, some of which launched with enthusiasm only to fade from focus. And while growth journeys are rarely linear, the pattern recognition among viewers keeps the debate alive, especially when fans recall prior short-lived projects and question long-term sustainability. And still, it is important to acknowledge that personal circumstances, including health challenges within the family and the emotional aftermath of loss, could reasonably slow expansion. Because farming is physically demanding, and leadership in such a venture requires stamina, coordination, and resilience. And supporters emphasize that home construction on the property may represent foundational stability before commercial development, suggesting that securing residence was step one in a phased plan, rather than evidence of abandonment. And that interpretation reframes the narrative from stalled ambition to strategic sequencing. Yet critics counter that promotional language framed the farm as actively building from the ground up, creating expectations of visible agricultural preparation rather than primarily residential progress. And this divergence between expectation and observation forms the heart of the suspense, because neither side possesses complete information, and without transparent timelines, speculation becomes the dominant currency. Online forums continue to analyze acreage maps, zoning data, and blog statements, searching for clues about Army Corps surveys and permit applications, while others step back and focus on broader symbolism, noting that land ownership alone can represent empowerment, and that not every dream must immediately monetize to hold value. And yet, the branding of Tada Farms as a commercial flower enterprise with invitations for followers to join the journey implies eventual public-facing production. And so, the central question persists. Will there be rows of peonies, sunflowers, wildflower fields open for community picking days, weddings framed by floral backdrops, farm stands offering seasonal bouquets? Or will the vision evolve into a smaller lifestyle garden, supporting private enjoyment rather than large-scale commerce? And the suspense loop tightens as seasons change, because agriculture is cyclical, and each planting window that passes without visible cultivation becomes another marker in the timeline. Viewers count months, then years, measuring anticipation against absence, and still no definitive update resolves the tension. The land remains documented, the business registration stands, merchandise continues circulating, and homes rise from foundations, but fields remain visually unchanged, at least from what the public can confirm. And so the story balances delicately between possibility and pause, between optimism and doubt, between preparation and perception. And it is precisely this unresolved state that sustains audience engagement, because certainty, whether triumphant or Those 156 acres is a slow, meticulous process unfolding away from cameras. Or is the dream quietly shifting shape? And as we stand in this unresolved chapter, the only confirmed truths are the acreage, the filing dates, the promotional launch, and the passage of time. Everything else remains possibility. And that lingering uncertainty is what keeps audiences invested, waiting for the moment when either blossoms appear across the Carolina soil or a candid update clarifies the path forward. Because until then, Tada Farms exists in a space between vision and visibility, and that space is where suspense lives. At the end of the day, the land is real, the license is real, and the promises were very public, but the flowers are still missing, and until we see actual fields in bloom, the questions are not going anywhere. Maybe Tada Farms is slowly growing behind the scenes, or maybe the vision is changing in real time. Either way, we will be watching every update closely. So if you want the truth without the noise, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now and join the family, because we are just getting started and you do not want to miss what happens next.